Welcome to those who are coming in. Thank you for joining us. Just as ever with any of these things, going to give it a minute or two just for people to start filtering in the first couple of minutes of the hour. So yeah, feel free to have yourself a quick drink over the next 30 seconds to a minute, and then we'll get started quite quickly because we do have a fair bit of content that we want to get through in the hour. So we don't want to wait too long for people to join. And then obviously the recording for the session will be available afterwards. So if people do miss the first couple of minutes, then it's something they can catch up on. Okay, wonderful. We are going to get started. As I say, we've got quite a lot of content to get through in the hour. I want to make sure we get through as much of it as possible. And we will be leaving some time at the end for people to send in their questions during the session. So if you could pop your questions in the Q&A function, and that's something we'll pick up towards the end. Thank you for joining us. This is one of a number of pieces of content that we've got coming up over the next few months, focusing on fundraising for charities alongside other pieces we've done in the past, around fundraising campaigns and individual giving. Today's session, we're going to be focusing on a guide to successful bid writing, and we're not going to pretend that after just an hour, you're going to go from having no bid writing experience to having a 100% success rate. That's obviously not plausible, but what we're hoping to impart today is loads of different approaches and tips and things to consider that will help you on this journey. And hopefully there'll be something for you, whether you've never written a bid before and this is something you're going to be doing for the first time in the future, or for those of you who have got bid writing experience and just want to have some sort of refresher, or just want to hear from other people about how they might approach it. But absolutely, bid writing does remain something that is quite subjective, but nonetheless, hopefully we've got some really useful pieces of advice and tips for you. My name's Aaron. I'm head of Trust and Foundations here at Oaks. So we support organisations in a number of areas of fundraising, of which grant funding from trust foundations and other grant-making bodies is a big part of that work, alongside other areas of support such as strategic planning and income generation. Jess, would you like to introduce yourself as well? So I'm joined by my colleague Jess.
Hi everyone, I'm Jess. I'm an account manager at Oaks. I work in the Trust and Foundations side of the company, and I've supported on a breadth of organisations from multi-academy trusts to charities and support for development organisations. So I've had a real grasp on writing different bids and the do's and don'ts. So hopefully we'll be able to share some of those tips and those foundations today.
Great, thanks Jess. And behind any half-decent presenter is someone who's manning the IT side of things. So we have our colleague Tilly, who you won't see or hear from today, but she's just making sure that everything goes smoothly. And if we do have any technical issues, then just try to correct them as soon as possible. As I say, we've got an hour for today's session, hoping to leave some time towards the end for questions and answers. So feel free to use the chat function, which we will monitor as best we can throughout. And a recording of the session will be made available to everyone after. So if for any reason you're unable to stay on, but we hope you can. In terms of the agenda for today's session, I'm going to look at how to build a case of support for your organisation. So the key questions you want to be asking yourselves internally when presenting yourself as an organisation. Looking at evidence and the need for your work. So actually this is a real key component for successful bids, particularly when you start looking at applications for higher values. So really strengthening the evidence and need for your work. Writing compelling bids, so actually how you tell that story throughout bids that you write. And then lastly, just top tips, as I say, hopefully a wide variety of advice approaches for you to consider in addition to any approaches that you currently use. And really what we want to cover today is, breaking up these subjects into kind of two areas of bid writing. So a good application is one that pretty much stands out the way, really, and lets the content of what you do as an organization shine through, or let the content of what you will do on a project shine through an application that is really effective, but actually feel like you're not worried about the application itself. And so the first couple of sections on the agenda are very much focused on actually the quality of the content that you can and should include in an application. And then the second two parts of the agenda are focused on including it in a really effective way. So actually the more on the writing side of it. So firstly, looking at that, building a case for support and how to go about selling your organization and work. When I talk about a case for support, or when we talk about a case for support, we're talking about a narrative, essentially, about you're presenting yourself as an organization to external bodies, whether that could be grant funders, which is the subject of today's session, but that could also be potential corporate partners, it could be the community. We're looking at actually how you present yourself and what is the story about why people should support you. So to underpin good funding applications, it's a really useful exercise to go through to start to develop a case for support and make it a detailed document that you can then use to underpin all the applications you write, for the next year or so. So you kind of ask yourself some key questions, prepare some narrative around those key questions that you can then adapt for applications you write. And hopefully what that does is also make it easier and more efficient and quicker to jump from one application to the next alongside all the number of busy things that you're doing. If you can get one approved by your organization, you can respond quicker to deadlines, you can avoid unnecessary repetitive conversations that you might need with colleagues if you're looking to write about certain projects. And if you've got the time, it could be quite useful to have one for your organization as a whole. So if you're ever applying for core funding or unrestricted funding, then having a case of support for your organization as a whole, or having one for each of your funding priorities. So if you're going to be applying for multiple applications over the coming months, and it's going to be for the same project, then having a case of support for that dedicated project will be a really helpful exercise. And what you'll find over time is that a case for support will evolve. So you might complete a project or a period of work and have loads of great impact and outcome data, which you want to include in your next few applications. You might encounter a new question in an application that you've never encountered before, and want to include kind of your response to that in future applications. So it will continue to evolve, and that's definitely something that is natural and really good to respond to. But Jess is going to talk through the key areas that we think should be encompassed in a case of support. So about your organization, about the need for your work, about your solution, so the work you're doing to tackle that need, the impact you're achieving, and then a little bit about sustainability. So what happens in future for your organization.
So the 5 key things that we think are really integral for building up your case for, the first one being your organization. So why should an organization give to you? What about your organization is interesting to the funder? So the first thing you want to think about is the background of your organization. When were you established? For what purpose? What's your vision and mission? Often you have to talk about your aims and objectives within there, and kind of the impact outcomes that as an organization you have on the community and the areas that you work in. You want to talk about your experience, kind of what projects you've delivered, the success of these, the changes that you've made, and you can use case studies from previous programs and projects to help you build this up. These are all really important and can be replicated for every kind of application that you do. You want to talk about who leads your organization, so the trustees, the staff, the volunteers, all of these people who make up your project and your programs. They're integral to your organization, so really important to keep in contact. And then you want to talk about the involvement of your organization, so what networks and partnerships you have, whether you do community work, what members you have of the community, who you work with throughout the community itself. It's really important. Sorry, go on.
No, carry on. I was about to say, and just to come in on one of those points, it's this will look completely different for different organisations. So, as Jess says, if you want to talk about who leads your organisation, you might have trustees that have got a vast experience in a subject that the fund is interested in. You want to highlight that. If you've delivered a one key project for the last 5-10 years, you've got a real great bank of outcome data to support that, then you definitely want to highlight anything like that. So it will look different depending on what strengths you feel you have in the organisation. Great. We go to the next slide.
Next thing in your case support is the needs. You were talking about why the need in the area, what is the purpose of your organisation, what would happen if you didn't exist, and what is the cause of you existing. You'll be looking at the problem, so the problem that you're addressing in your area. So this all comes down to the purpose of your organisation and the implications that occur because of you existing in the work that you do. You'll be looking at the benefits that you have and the positive impacts that you have on the local community and your areas that you work in general. In order to justify this, you'll be looking at evidence. So who identified this problem, what research is there around it that we have locally, nationally, regionally. There's a vast amount of research on every single characteristic that your organisation might be fulfilling. So it's really important to have a look and see what supports you. You can look at the feedback from previous programs to justify your need and your purpose. And that's really important when you're writing an application, because you don't just want it to be global statistics, you want it to be personable. You want the funder to really understand who you are as an organisation and why it is that you're doing. And then for context, you want to see if there's anyone else trying to fix the problem. So a lot of funders will look, if you're doing collaboration work with other communities, you can talk about other communities, other organisations that do similar things to you and ways you can work together, or ways that separate you. And if you're running a more innovative programme, ways that separate you from other organisations, which can really make you stand out compared to other ones.
Yeah, and that last point is really, really important. I think, funding assessors get so many applications at any one time that if you're one of dozens of organisations in your area that are doing the type of work that you do, then it's really helpful to have a think before you write an application about what makes your work different in any way, or if your work is very similar to other organisations, then are there any opportunities for collaboration, or why isn't the work of other organisations suitable for your beneficiaries? Because funders will get a number of applications if they have a certain thematic interest, or they have a fund that looks to address certain priorities, then the likelihood is that you're going to be up against loads of other organisations that are doing similar work. So what sets you apart, or why aren't other services suitable for the people that you work with? And that comes back to Jess's point around how have you captured the views and feedback of beneficiaries. They might be telling you that another service in your area isn't right for them for XYZ reason, and that's a really great argument to be able to make when you sell your organisation.
Yeah, definitely. The third thing that we consider when we think of the case for support is the solution. So what as an organisation is the solution to the problem and the reason that you're able to support that need in your area. So you think about the targets. So what's the aim of your project or your programme? What are the KPIs? So what outcomes are you expecting to see at the end of it? And what objectives do you set yourself that you expect to see at the end of the programme? You think about the delivery of the programme and your performance indicators. So if you expect to see increased confidence, for example, you say how you expect to see that and in what ways your programme or your project will meet that outcome. So delivery, what tangible activities will you undertake? So you think about what activities you'll run from the start of the programme to the end of the programme. You can timestamp these to make it really understandable from a fund's perspective, so they can see you're asking for X amount of money and they can see this is going at each stage of the process. And you want to look at what does the beneficiary journey look like. So when they start your program, where are they at? What do they have going on with them, which is the reason you're supporting them? And then at the end of the program, what do you expect to see from them? What changes do you expect to see? And how do you expect to see development? When we think about beneficiaries, we have to think about why it's good for them. So this is bringing it back to the need. You see a need in your area and you think, what differentiates our organisation to be able to meet the needs of the beneficiaries, and what places you in the best position to support them. So when you think about that, you really shape your activities and your programme around them. So you think about the area they're in, what facilities are available, what equipment's available, what you're able to give to them, which fits within the means of their own lives, and that really enables you to deliver the most effective and efficient programme for them.
Yeah, and we'll come on to some of these subjects in a bit more detail later. So, where we talk about what does a beneficiary journey look like and what tangible activities you undertake, we'll come on to that a bit later in terms of key questions, the key answers you want to be providing.
The fourth case of support, we think about the impact. So what difference do we make? So we've had the solution, we've got the program that we want to run, and now you have to think about the impact. So what are the short-term and long-term impacts of the programs that we're going to be running? And as an organisation, what does that mean for you? So you want to think about the main outcomes of your work. So what can you be accountable for, and what do you contribute to your beneficiaries? You want to think about the attributable to your work, so the outcomes which you give off, so the reach that you have with the engagement that you receive from your beneficiaries. You'll think about the resources that you have. So how will you measure this? So you think about your monitoring and evaluation tools. Will you do questionnaires, surveys, verbal communication, develop a steering group, things like that. So you want to think about the longevity of your feedback and how you can make a difference, not just at the end of the 6-month program you might be running, but after a year and 2 years, and whether you're able to maintain it. And to think of the impact, you'll think about, does this fit with the organisation's missions and visions, what we spoke about earlier? So the aims and objectives of your organisation, are you meeting them through these programmes? Are you able to develop on your own organisation and able to share and use what you've learned and what you develop throughout the programme onto other programmes that you run and with your community?
Yeah, and impact is such a big point when it comes to applying for funding. We've only got an hour so today, and we're focusing on the bid writing side of things. So we're not going to go into loads of detail about how to improve your impact measurement work. But if you are reflecting on your organization and where you're at, and you're saying to yourself, I think this is an area we can improve on, then that is definitely something you should start the process of doing in terms of improving how you capture the outcomes that you're achieving. Because when you apply for funding, it's one of the most powerful, compelling areas that can help to persuade a funder to fund you, that you actually have good impact data to highlight that you've got programs that have been successful in the past, or that you've got ways that you of measuring the impact of the work that they're going to fund, which is absolutely something they want to see.
One consideration for your case support should be sustainability. So how will you be able to achieve longer term impact? Funders want to know that you aren't going to be reliant on them for the next 5 years or so, that once you've finished your funding with them, you're going to be able to look for elsewhere or retain that and continue your projects and your programs. So you'll think about what happens when the grant funding ends. You have to think about, what are your next steps? What will you do next? Will you look at retained funds? Will you go to other funders? Will you end the program? The funders are really interested in knowing about this, and it really helps them to know whether to give you funding or not. What will the legacy of the program be for the beneficiaries? Will you have feeding programs where they can go on to other community work, other community social groups, which can really support them, which shows the benefit of your program to helping them get from that A to B? You want to think about the finances. So will this project generate any income? So when you're writing your budget, you'll have that all clearly laid out for what areas you'll be spending your money on for the program. But you also think about what comes back into you. And will you secure any other funding through contracts, local work, fundraising? All of these things are really important for the sustainability of a program. And finally, you'll think about improvement. So how will what you've learned from the programme change what you do in the future, change other programmes that you've run and other projects to be more efficient and more beneficial for your participants. Finally, if you'll think about whether it's a pilot programme, can you approach other funders to replicate the work in years 2, years 3, and you can change bits to suit what you've learned from the first year. And that can be a really, really pinnacle point for applying for other funders, with them seeing the changes and the learnings that you've had. Shows your integrity with monitoring evaluation and your dedication to really listening to what your beneficiaries need.
Yeah, and sustainability is probably the hardest area of these different subjects when we talk about a case of support. And it's hard enough as a charity to manage all the different work that you've got going on, let alone predict into the future, let alone predict into the future for a particular program. Everyone's so busy with delivering the work and fundraising across loads of different areas that actually forecasting how you make something sustainable is one of the great questions for an organization. And so it's definitely not a case of needing to have everything 100% exactly figured out. There's just a question here that funders want to know, actually, as Jess said, what is the legacy of the project? And just having to think through these different questions and then say it could be that the program doesn't continue beyond the funding, and actually you have to focus on what are the long-term benefits to the beneficiaries who did participate while it was running. If you do intend to run it, then just some thoughts about how you would go about that. And as with anything we talk about today, the general rule is that if you're applying for larger and larger amounts of funding, the stronger these components of your work and application need to be. So, organisations that are giving you a grant for £100,000 plus over multiple years, they'll definitely want to see some sort of sustainability beyond that grant, because that's a significant investment at a local smaller level. If it's a grant of, let's say, £5,000 or below, there might be less onus on sustainability, but a funder might still have an interest to see what happens after that grant. And so just having a think around what does the picture look like can be helpful. So that's kind of where we like to recommend starting. So here are key areas that we expect that you're going to get asked in loads of different applications. So start having to think about those questions and how you would approach them. As I said at the start, that will continually evolve over time as you do more work. The one area I want to focus on in the next bit is around the need. And so evidence of the need and how it can be used to strengthen bids and projects as well. The reason why it's important from a bid writing perspective is because if you've applied for loads of grants before, or just a small number of grants before, there's a good chance that you are aware that a lot of grants are unsuccessful because funders didn't deem the evidence of need to be as strong as the other applications that they received. And that's a key point as well, with that actually anytime you apply for funding, you're in a very competitive landscape. So there's always scope for you to improve because you're up against other organisations that are looking to improve in this way as well. If you apply to funders like the National Lottery Community Fund, or BBC Children in Need, a lot of funders are putting an emphasis on community involvement in how projects get shaped, and how they get developed over time, and how they get delivered when it comes to the delivery phase. And so you might get feedback saying that people who would benefit from the work have not been meaningfully involved in that process enough. And so this is why evidence of the need becomes really important, because it is something that funders are looking at. If funders, rightly understand that the programs that are most successful, that will be most successful, have taken on board the direct views and feedback of the beneficiaries that a project will target. So you'll have that direct consultation, that direct work as one approach. The challenge, if you don't have that, is that when you apply and write applications, you'll be wholly reliant on secondary data. And by that, I mean information that comes from sources outside of your own organisation or your beneficiaries. That is really good for adding credibility to your arguments and painting a wider picture of a challenge. But if it's your main or only source of evidence why your work is needed in an application, then it isn't as compelling as having that direct consultation. An overuse of statistics or surveys can be dehumanizing. People often use statistics or surveys in a way that isn't always relevant for the project they're going to deliver. And the challenge about using statistics is that often you'll get survey statistics from publicly available information, and a funding assessor might read a lot of the same statistics information when they're assessing applications at once. So if you're using feedback, views, consultation with your target audiences directly, that is something that won't be replicated in other applications, and that's what makes it more compelling. So whether that's doing it through formal questionnaires, interviews, it could be ad hoc informal conversations, focus groups. You might have a waiting list. You might speak to partners, so you might not be able to engage new target groups directly, but you might speak to partner organizations who are engaging those groups, who can provide really useful insight. And so I'll highlight a couple of examples to bring that point to life about the limitations of relying on secondary data in your applications. So here we have a real example, and it said about research showing that same-sex role models are important in influencing perceptions, self-esteem, and valuation abilities when it comes to women and girls playing in sport. So that's taken from a survey which I have redacted and just replace the name with. But the question that you would have as a funding assessor reading that is it important to girls locally? So if you're applying for a local project that was looking to get women and girls more active, benefiting from physical activity in sports, that national research might not correlate with the views of women and girls locally. So you might put on a project thinking that the most important thing to women and girls locally is that they have a female coach or a female activity leader. And then what you might then happen is put on a project based on that and actually not address problems that are preventing women and girls locally from participating. That might be a lack of inclusive facilities or safe facilities where they feel comfortable participating. So using kind of secondary data from national studies and research when your project is a local level or regional level can be not always relevant. Also, unless the funder specifically asks for it, we would recommend avoiding essay-style references in applications, just because a lot of funders have maximum word counts or character counts, and that takes up a lot of it. It makes it feel like a dissertation. So yes, you can reference kind of the source of information, but maybe not in a full essay-style reference. And to take another example of how secondary data can be limited, this one says local statistics show obesity is a real problem, and that 33% of Year 6 pupils are overweight or obese in our community. This suggests young people do not have access to regular physical activity opportunities. So a couple of things that funder assessor that I've worked with before highlighted as why that can be limited. First of all, the word suggests there, it's doing a lot of heavy lifting. So there's an uncertainty about what is actually causing the challenge. The assumption is it is a lack of physical activity that's causing that issue, but there might be plenty of physical activity opportunities. It might be that they come at a cost, or it might be a high prevalence of unhealthy food places or something like this. And secondly, if you're targeting a project that is quite has a small number of beneficiaries, so it might benefit less than 100 people, which is still a lot of people, but in the context of 33% of all Year 6 pupils in an area, changing kind of 100 people's habits is going to have a limited effect on the 33%. So actually what you're looking for is what causes that 33%, and that's the need that you're looking to address.
We're now going to talk a little bit about needs, output, and outcomes. These are based on our experience through writing bids, really things that come up all the time in applications, the kind of 3 pivotal stories really, which we have to time and time again think about, and this is why it made quite a large part of the case support anyway, but we're going to kind of delve into that a little bit more now. The first bit is need, so writing about the need. So you have to think about what is the need important for your project, what are you trying to address, why is the project needed, and what evidence do you have that fits this, that this need exists. So when writing about need, like Aaron said, it's really important to use your emotion and emotional input to really strengthen your case. Using stats from the internet is great when they can really strengthen your argument, but like Aaron said, using feedback can really, really strengthen your argument. So it's important to describe the problem, need as a community, and then target group sees it. So how the community actually feel, it's important to really use their voice throughout your bid, and to not make it all about your organisation and the importance for you, but for why you're helping the community. The most important thing to do is to back this up. So back it up with the evidence that we suggested. So feedback, questionnaires, all of this is so important for you to convey to the funder why you're needed. It's important to involve people in design and development of the project. So who can you involve in this? Can you get a volunteer program? Are you supporting employability? Are you working with other members of the community? Why you differentiate from other community organisations, and what you're doing differently that others aren't doing that you can help. It's important to be as specific as possible. This way the funder knows exactly what you're doing, exactly why you're needed, and what work you're doing. This way they don't have any secondary questions about, oh, we're unsure about this. They can really understand everything. Next is outputs. So writing about outputs, it's clear. Is it clear to someone who doesn't know the project that you're running that they understand it once you've written it? So you talk about your project, what will be delivered, and what ideas you need to address. So you'll be thinking about the activities. So you'll be writing out a key stage from the stage 1 to stage 3, for example, of the activities that you'll be running, the dates that these will be running on, who's going to deliver them. So will you need to employ a new member of staff? Will you be supported by volunteers, and why they're best placed to do this? A lot of times we use examples of awards or reputation to justify this, and it can be really useful for a funder when you're explaining, if you've got a program running in mental health, for example, why this person is most suitable to support young people who may be struggling with their mental health. You need to discuss where the project will take place. Is it easy, accessible for everyone? Is it inclusive? Are they going to be able to attend there regularly? You'll think about when the project will start and when it will finish. Does this fit within the funder's guidelines? Does it fit within your budget? How often will it take place? And then from there, you'll break down the budget. You'll think about how many people will be involved. So how many beneficiaries will be involved? How regularly will they attend? Will it be the same group every time? All of these questions are really, really important to think about when you're thinking about your outputs. And it really helps you address the need that you talked about earlier. You'll talk about who else will be involved to make the project. Is it just yourselves as an organisation, or are there any third parties? It's so helpful to help demonstrate this. So talking about your connections, the work that you've done previously can really boost your outputs that you're trying to talk about. And finally, we've got outcomes. So what will the project achieve? What difference will it make to the people involved? Here you'll focus on social inclusion, for example. You'll focus on the changes people undergo as a result of taking part in your chosen activities. So you've had your project, you've spoke about it, and you've justified the need and why your organisation is best placed to support them. You'll now talk about what changes you'll make, what you expect to see, what you anticipate will be improved in your beneficiaries throughout the programme. You'll ensure your outcomes are really clearly connected to the objectives of the chosen funder and what they want to see. We really tend to use language written by the funders to help connect this to them, to show that we've paid attention, that we understand that our project is best suited for them, and this is how. You'll talk about changes that can be measured. So next time, if you were to replicate the programme, or if you were to repeat it and get different funding, what can be changed, and how have you come to establish that? Is that through feedback? Is that through coaches or volunteers? It's important to be confident but realistic. You need to ensure that the funder knows what you want to do, that you will do this and you will change that, and you will ensure the beneficiaries will receive X amount of sessions, but you want to be realistic with it. You don't want to promise the funder that you're going to change the world when you're supporting a local community, but you can be realistic with the changes you can make with that community. So it's important to be very wary and realistic around the language that you use. And it's really important to ensure there's a logical link between the needs and outputs you identified. So are the outputs you identified matching the needs, and do the outcomes make sense from this? So if you're saying the need in your area is one thing, is the activity you're doing going to meet that need, and are the outcomes you expect to see going to help?
Yeah, and just to highlight a couple of those points with real examples, just because, as I said earlier, we're not going to use this session to talk about how to improve your impact measurement data, but certainly it's a real big part of being successful applications is writing well about the outcomes that the change is going to make. So, as just said, focus on changes rather than engagement or delivery when it comes to outcomes. So you might lean towards highlighting that you're going to engage 20 young people in sessions that get them active or increase their social interaction, improve their mental health. The engagement itself is not an outcome. The engagement, or because you engage 20 people in a session, doesn't mean that they've had any change in their lives. So when you write about outcomes, make sure you're focusing on changes. So we will increase, we will improve, we will decrease, we will help, whatever it is. So you're focusing on a change rather than reach. When you write about outcomes, keep them simple. So the funder can clearly see, what are the changes you're going to measure, and that it is possible to measure them. Short sentences when it comes to specifically writing about outcomes. Identify changes that can be measured and attributed to your work. So again, I'll show an example on the next slide about this, but if you're working with children and young people, then an outcome that you probably don't want to subscribe yourself to is that you're going to prevent them from experiencing illnesses such as diabetes in future, because this project is working with them while they're at a young age and you can't possibly guarantee that. However, an outcome that is more attributable to work at this age group would be improving healthy lifestyles, and as a result, you might reduce the risk of health issues in future. On the point about being confident but realistic, there's part of this which is actually just conviction in your language. So when you're talking about outcomes, we will change this rather than we hope to or we want to. You're trying to persuade a funder to give you, funding instead of hundreds of other organizations. So having conviction in the changes that you believe in. But as I said earlier, making sure that your changes are relevant to the activity you're delivering. So you're not going to tackle whole areas, obesity rates. If you engage 16 children in a project, for instance, you can absolutely make an impact for each of those 16 children, but it's going to have a limited impact in the wider scope of a whole community. And then making sure you're adapting your outcomes to suit the target group. So again, I'm going to keep using children and young people as an example because I know how many organizations are working with children and young people. If you're working with year 6 pupils, so they're at the age of 11, your outcomes might not be focused on employment. So you don't want to say you're going to help them secure employment, because there's at least 5 years between the age of 11 and when they might start looking at work. And so you can't possibly subscribe yourself to them finding employment, but what you can talk about is the skills they develop which are helpful for future employment. So just making sure that you adapt your outcomes to suit your target group. So here's an example of how to write about an outcome. So 24 men aged 60 plus living in single person households will feel less lonely after 6 months through attending our weekly support and share coffee runs. So it's specific, so it's focusing on specific target group, and it actually has a target about how many men will benefit as well. So the more specific you can be, the better. As I keep saying, if you're applying for larger levels of funding, then more likely funders will be expecting specific target outcomes. It's measurable, so you can measure whether people feel less lonely through surveys, through interviews, focus groups. There are a number of accredited surveys out there they can get people to respond to. It's achievable, so it's realistic that the nature of the work you're doing focuses on the outcome and it's attributable. It's relevant. So if you've highlighted that people feeling less lonely is an outcome you want to achieve, and then you can bring that back to whatever trust, foundation, or grant making body, whatever their mission is. So the mission of hypothetical funder is to improve mental health and protect older adults from social isolation. So making that relevant, and it's time bound as well. So it's after 6 months. So it's highlighted when you're going to be looking at measuring that change. And the point about relevant actually is something we probably should have started by saying at the very start, that one of the first tips we'll give people who are looking at the bid right is to make sure you read the funder's guidelines. As Jess said on the previous slide, you want to link back to funders' outcomes. And so hopefully they have guidelines that articulate clearly what outcomes they want to see, what their objectives are. They'll use language that you can then replicate when you're trying to align yourself with their work. So we always recommend when it comes to bid writing, start by reading funders' guidelines. And then that point around telling a story and having a logical link between each section. So as we said, the needs, the outputs and outcomes are three of the most common things you need to write about when you apply for funding. So making sure there's that consistency and that narrative throughout it. So if you're highlighting something as a need or challenge to be addressed, making sure that the work you're doing fits in addressing that, and making sure that the outcomes, the changes that you say you're going to achieve, then address those challenges. So if you're looking at working with young people who are struggling to find employment, then delivering employability training that's really relevant for that, and your outcomes that you'll develop skills to improve job prospects. If you're looking at yourself as an organization rather than the impact on your beneficiaries, then it's still about telling that story. So within the needs, your organization, you might be a mental health charity and you lack the resources needed to keep up with demand for your services. So what are you going to do with the funding? We're going to recruit and employ 2 confidential Healthline support workers. And as a result, you're going to be able to have more capacity to address the long waiting list that you have for your Healthline services. So still just making sure it's consistent. If you highlight youth unemployment as a problem, don't talk too much in your outcomes about addressing antisocial behaviour, for instance, because you're highlighting a change, which is great, but you're highlighting a change that doesn't address the problem necessarily. So making sure that you're telling that story consistently.
Finally, going to talk about a few top tips that we have found through our writing. Hopefully they're helpful. So breaking up blocks of text can be really effective for writing applications. So using things like bullet points, lists, headings, and other style text on the right example is so much more effective than the left. It can really engage a funder. It can make it easy to read. It can make it easy to follow, and it can be much more useful for conveying the points that you have. It can also make it easier for yourselves when you come to writing it. You can clearly see where you've written your needs, your outputs, and your outcomes. It's easy to separate them, which can be really effective. You really want to make your introduction stand out. If there's so often funders will read, this is your organisation, we were set up in 2003, for example, and we do this, which is really good because it's saying what you do, but you want to really set off with your case support. So start off with what you want to do, what you do as an organisation. You want to start from the get-go with bringing the funder in, enticing them in with something which is going to make them want to read on. So things like an impact statement or a quote from a partner or a coach that you support, you have supported, can be really interesting and immediately lay out your case of support.
And this is a particularly good tip. Obviously, if you're writing a application where you have free reign over how you structure it, we understand that when you apply for funding, you'll get a lot of set application forms. You'll get online portals where you're limited in how you can structure it. Even still, we'd recommend trying to do things like writing on a Word document and then copy and pasting over like bullet points, for instance, and break up blocks of text if that's possible. But this tip is definitely relevant for those trusts and foundations in particular, where you kind of write them your own application. They say cover some broad points, but it's up to you how you structure it. So we understand there are times where you have limitations around that, but this is where you have that freedom.
So using dynamic language, using different language can be so important when you're writing your applications. And there are a lot of different ways you can do this. So language being the first one. So we recommend finding the shortest way to say something and including short words. For example, using also instead of moreover, show instead of demonstrate, then instead of subsequently. Now, we understand that this isn't always the case, and sometimes you are constrained by funder word limits, character limits, things like that. But this in general is a good rule of thumb to follow. It's not saying that you will always do it, but where possible, it's really good to try and include shorter sentences and more concise language. It allows you to demonstrate what you're actually showing, the project you're running, rather than the language you're using. We suggest sentences, so limiting more sentences to less than 20 words when you can. Try and use, like we said, concise language, short sentences, allow your project to shine rather than the language you're using to show it off. A lot of funders, they're not bothered about the language you use, as in fancy language or an elaborate way of explaining the program. They want to see that need, outcome, output very nicely, concisely explained so that they can see why you should get the funding. The best way to do this is as being as direct and open as possible. With the content, avoid trying to cover every single detail about the project or organisation in an answer. If you have a word limit of 500 words, for example, and you have 3 really strong points and then 1 smaller point at the end, just to try and fill the words, just to try and avoid using that last example. You can use those words to strengthen the previous points you've used. For like the example here, we could also look to deliver. You don't really need that extra bit if you've already got 3 really strong examples, and you can even work on strengthening those rather than adding in an extra point. Repetition, so jump straight into your answer rather than repeating the question. If the funder's asking you, what are we funding you for? You don't necessarily need to start with, we need funding for. You can go into talking about your program, talking about your project without going off what they've already said. If anything, you're only limiting your own word count. As we see, it's hard to stick with some of them, especially tighter word counts. So you've really got to make the most of every single word that you use. And finally, consistency. So ensuring things described, spelled the same, and the way you just bring it across in an application. So when you're talking about children and young people, making sure you're being consistent with that language, making sure you're being consistent with the ways you describe them and the needs that you're talking about. Aaron mentioned earlier, if you're saying you've got antisocial behaviours need in your area, talking about X, Y, and Z, which is different from that later on, is all good because they're supporting arguments, but it's not the need you originally spoke about. So try to stick to that original one and really allow yourself the depth and go into it. It will show the funds that you're very thought through for what your project needs and why your organisation is best placed to support it.
Yeah, and then one point I'd pick on is that middle point around the content. So avoid trying to cover every single detail. I've worked with organisations long enough to understand where that comes from. It comes from being very passionate about the work you do and being very proud about the depth things you can do. But just keeping the application focused. Hopefully, it's an application where the funder has a question towards the end that asks if there's anything else you'd like to include, then you can do some detail there. But ultimately, just making sure that you're very much focused, and hopefully you'll get that opportunity to really show them how great you are. But the application should remain focused. And then the tip that I'll talk through is ensuring clarity for the reader. So this will be a big point that you often hear us say, but if a funding assessor has no idea who you are as an organisation, if they're a national funder and you work locally, then they won't have huge familiarity with the area that you work in. Just making sure there's no kind of assumed knowledge. It's a bit different if you're applying to a local funder and are very familiar with the area. But in that first one, don't assume the assessor has any knowledge of your context. So you avoid using phrases because of recent events in the town our projects needed to. If I'm a national funder, I don't know what those events might be, what was the impact of them. If they're a local funder, then obviously that's a bit different. There will be an opportunity for them to progress onto our Achieve program. So that might be a really logical link for you because you understand the organisation, you understand the project you are applying for versus a project that's quite well connected as a pathway or an exit route for your beneficiaries. But a funding assessor won't necessarily know that if they've never funded your organization before, and they won't have time to call you up to ask. They're going to be inundated with applications. So if you're going to say something like that, hopefully include some space about what the Achieve program is, why is it a natural progression, a route. Avoid flooding your application with jargon, abbreviation, etc. Again, if you've got a funder that is a specialist in the sector you're applying for, then that might be a bit different. But flooding it with abbreviations, again, it just loses the sense of kind of the purpose of the sentences if they have to look things up or if they don't know what something specifically is. So our project will be effective because we will use the ABC approach. That might be common language in your sector, in the work that you do with other organizations. But if it's a funder that isn't a specialist in that area, then they might think about, well, what is the approach? Is it proven to be effective? We have worked with NDSOs to increase our insight of their needs. Again, what is an NDSO and what insight that resulted in? So just questions rather than answers being generated. And this one is a real big thing that I advise organizations on all the time, is that using tangible examples is really what makes the content of your applications compelling. A lot of people, when they write applications, they feel they have to try and say all of the things that their funders want to hear. Actually, as we've said a couple of times, let the content of your work shine through, and real examples bring to life the work that you're actually doing. So the phrase "we will target the hardest to reach children," for instance, is fine in itself, but what really makes that statement powerful is actually your understanding of what that makes them hard to reach. A lot of funders don't like the phrase "hard to reach" because actually people might not be hard to reach. It's just that organizations lack the ability to reach them. So actually, what are the challenges that are creating that setup for those beneficiaries, and actually how specifically will you target them? That's what a funder wants to hear, not just that you will target them, but they want to know how you're going to do that. We will consult with beneficiaries on an ongoing basis. As a funding assessor, I want to know more. Again, what gives that statement weight is clear plans for how you're going to consult with them, when will that happen. Consulting with our community is very important, helps us shape our work. Again, it's actually the details and real examples of how that happened that shows to a funder that is valuable to your organization. So rather than just saying that it's important to you, can you give any examples in the past where you've shaped a program differently, or you've introduced something new, or you've stopped delivering something because of feedback from your target group? And if you're talking about your project, then more specificity the better. So the workshops will cover topics important to young people locally. What are those topics specifically, and why are they important? And that comes back to elsewhere in your application about why the work is needed. Have young people told you that these subjects are important? That is it from us. As I said, we wish we could have gone on for so much longer. We've only got an hour in the diary, but thank you very much for your time listening. As I say, we've got our contact details here. We'll be sending out to all people who've registered follow-up in terms of other things to explore, and the recording of the session as well. A lot of information we've fired at you as well. So if you do have any further questions, then please do get in touch. But just thank you for joining us. If you're anywhere in the Midlands like we are, then it's not a great day outside. So I appreciate you taking your time aside with us on the subject. Hopefully you've been able to use any questions. So I'm going to hand over to Jess to check if we've got any questions.
Yeah, if you've got any questions, you can pop in the Q&A box. But thank you all for coming. It was lovely to talk about bid writing and everything that we've learned from our applications.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. As I say, I can't see any questions at the moment. As I say, we will be sharing out the slides afterwards. Okay, wonderful. I have just double checked everything and we haven't got any questions. So yeah, as I say, don't hesitate to get in touch with us after today. If you have anything you'd like to explore further, we provide advice and support around grant funding, around other areas of income generation as well. So do get in touch if this is something that you'd like to look at your organisation. We'll be stopping the recording and yeah, hope you will have a wonderful day.
Thank you.